Alright, so let's start. We have discussed in the previous video what a CSV file is, how it's plain text. So it's just a file that contains strings. It contains plain text. And then what we're going to do in this video is we're going to write a small program that reads the text that is contained in any text file. And then we're going to do some string manipulation to take each one of the lines, chop them by the commas, and then use those choppings to create lists with the data that we are bringing in. Okay, as a reminder, the file that we're going to be working on is called grades.csv, and it contains names, first name, social security, values for the test, and then the final grade for these students. Okay, so it looks something like this. Now, the first thing that I would like to do is I would like to take all this content, all this text, and then bring it in as a string, or as one string, or as an array of strings into my program. And the way I'm going to do that is, first of all, I'm going to create a variable called string, and I'm going to call this row CSV. That's going to be all the text that is going to contain in the file. Is going to be contained in the file. And one of the easiest ways to read text from files in C# is by going to the system library that contains basically all the functionality of C#, going to inputs and outputs, the namespace, then going to the namespace file, which contains a lot of functions and a lot of goodies to manipulate text and to read text, so read and write. And then there is this one function called ReadAllText that goes to a file path, reads all the text, and then creates a string with all the text contained in that file. So if I do that, I can open and close parentheses, and then here inside of this function, I need to type the path of where my file is. So that would be, in my system, it's going to be something like this, because you can see that my file is in users, glx, desktop, CSV. So I can actually just, in my Windows Explorer, I can just click here, click copy, and then paste this here right away. Okay. However, that doesn't really work because if you remember, strings cannot accept the / character as such, because that character is very special when it comes to strings. That character is the character that we use to signify special characters. So for example, I don't know if you guys know, but for example, \n or \r, those are characters that signify a new line. All right. So because the backslash is used to escape characters and to create code for characters that do not have a specific key representation, then when you actually want to use that character as itself, you have to escape it itself. So when you're writing strings, 2 backslashes is basically 1 backslash that has been escaped. And this is sounding very strange now that I'm saying it, but yeah. So basically, when you write strings, you have to when you have a backslash character, and that's what you want in your string, you have to add another one to escape it. Now, this is not very clean. An alternative to this is using the @ sign and putting it in front of the string, so that what you're saying with this is that you're not going to escape anything in your string, and that backslash characters should be treated as such. They should not be treated as escaping characters. All right? Good. So if this works, then I should be able to now take the content of that file, so row CSV, which is a one large string, and then print it to the console. If I do that, and if I execute this code, hopefully I'm going to get the contents of that file. It's not going to get, oh yeah, because I forgot I am reading this is the path to the folder, but I actually need to specify which file do I want to read. I want to read grades.csv. If I execute this code, hopefully now, all right, and now you can see that I get all that text in one single string. But wait, what does it mean? How is it that I have all these lines one after the other if row CSV is supposed to be one string? I'm not doing a for loop to go over all of this, right? It is true, but remember that when you have strings, at the end of strings, we have this thing called the new line character, and it's this thing that I just showed before, the backslash with the N or the backslash with the R. And because that is a character, that is the character that tells the computer that you should go to a new line and keep writing there. So that's why even though it's one single string, we have this invisible character at the end that means go to the next line. And then when this gets printed into the console, we get all these lines one after the other instead of as a continuous one single line as a whole. All right. Okay, so that's great. And then the next thing that I need to do is I need to take this file and I need to chop it. First of all, I need to chop it in lines, in each one of these lines, because right now it's just one single string. And then each one of those lines, I would need to chop it with the commas, okay? Before I do that, instead of chopping all this text by each one of these lines, which is kind of a bit of a tedious, it's not tedious, actually quite easy, but I guess what I want to say is that I have an alternative when saying read all text, and it is that instead of using the read all text method, I could use an alternative method called system.io.file. And if you scroll, you see you have read all text, you have read all bytes to see the actual representation of those characters in binary, and then you have here read all lines. This method, I find it more interesting for what we're trying to do, because what it gives me back is is an array of all the lines. It reads all the lines of the file one by one, and then it returns an array of strings. So what this method is doing is that it's already chopping the string, the text contained in the file, is chopping it by different lines. So I'm going to use this, and then I'm going to copy paste here, and the path to the file. And then what I'm going to do now is I'm going to save this in a variable which is going to be an array of strings, and I'm going to call this, for example, CSV lines. Okay? And if I were to print this, then it probably won't print. It will probably tell me like system32 an array of strings. Yes, exactly. So what I need to do is, instead of that, I need to, with a for loop, to print each one of the CSV lines.length, each one of these lines one by one. So, okay. And if I run this code now, yes, so I have each one of the lines printed with a for loop. Okay. All right, so now let's go to the next part, which is we're going to now take each one of these lines, chop it, and then take each one of the elements one by one. Let's take a look at how to do that. Okay, so now that we have an array with all the lines, what I'm going to do is that instead of this for loop that I was using to print, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into each one of the lines in my CSV file, so each one of the strings that is contained in my array, and for each one of them, I'm going to split the line with the separator values. Because remember, if we have something that looks like this, each comma is separating, is basically telling me which one of the columns I should be in. So that's very easy to do. What we can do is we can say, I'm going to create an array. Well, before I do that, let me say, for example, I have CSV lines, for example, the first one, the second one, the third one, and because C# knows that these are strings, when I press the dot operator, it gives me access to all the operations and all the methods that I can use for string objects. And one of the most common ones, you can see it's already here highlighted in favorites, is a split, which tells me that I can split a string into substrings that are based on the characters in this array. And I can see that the return, what it's giving me back, is another string, another array of strings. So what I can say here is I can create another variable. I'm going to call this row data, okay? And this is going to be equal to the result of splitting this string, each one of the strings, by the character separator. And that's going to be the comma. And I want you to notice how in this case I am using the single quotes because this is a character, and characters in C# are written with the single quote. If it was double quotes, it would be taken as a string, and I believe that this will not work because it needs one single character as a separator. Is that correct? Yes, I'm getting an error here. Okay, so that's going to be that. Okay, and which means that now for each one of these, what I can say is, for example, I can write another for loop where I'm going to say, let me just print the value of row data. Let me print each one of these things to the console. Okay, so console write line and then row data at position J. And then if I run this code, you can see that I'm getting one by one. I am getting here printed on the console each one of the elements of each row. So we have last name, first name, SNS, test1, test2. So that's going to be the first row here. And then it's going to be alfalfa, allosius, the social security number, and so on and so on. I have each one of the elements now of the array of each one of these rows. Okay? So one thing that I want to do is, because you have noticed how I'm also parsing the very first row of the CSV file. And this first row is good for me to understand what type of information is in that row. This is typically called the header of the CSV file, but it's actually not meaningful when it comes to actual data. This is not a student data. This is just the header. So I probably don't want to parse that as data. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to start, instead of starting with the first line of my CSV, I'm going to start with the second line. So I'm going to start with I equals 1, so that I skip that first header row. And if I now go all the way up, you see that I am not printing anymore the header, because I don't want that as part of my data. Okay? And now that I have here, I have a string. I have an array that contains all the strings of each one of my rows separated by commas. Then now I can start with, because now I have all the individual data points, now I can do with this data whatever I need to do in my program. So for example, let's say that I wanted to create a list with all the first names of my students. The first names of my students are the second column. So the column that is in position number 1, because it's the second column and we start counting by 0. So what I could do is, here I could say create lists with the CSV data, and I could create here a new list, for example, first names, and this is going to be a new list of string objects. Okay, so I create an empty list, and then what I do here is that for each one of these rows, because I know that the row data is ordered by first element, second element, third element, etc. What I can say is, well, from the row data, can you take the second element? So that's going to be element number 1. And now can we take this second element, this string, and add it to the list of first names? So I can do first names dot add, and then row data here. So with the for loop, I'm going over all the rows, I'm splitting them, and then I'm taking the second element and adding it to this list. All right? And then just for the sake of making sure that this is working, I'm going to copy this for loop here. I'm going to change it to first names dot count, because I want to print all the names of this list, and I'm going to say console write line and then first names in position I. And if I run this code now, you can see that I get a list with all the first names. And just to make it a bit more clear, let me copy paste this here and say first names, and then just print that out to the console. Okay, so now I have indeed been able to take from the CSV file, I have been able to parse each one of the rows, and I have been able to just extract each one of the first names from this list and put them together in a list that I can now use. Sorry, I'm distracted because I got distracted because I was like, where is this name? It's not on the list, but it's because I copy pasted and I'm not starting from the beginning. So now this person, Aloysius, should be the first one. Okay, yeah, that was an error for copy. Copy pasting is the devil, okay? I keep saying it. Be very careful with copy pasting. It leads to a lot of badness, okay? My point being, I have been able now to read the whole CSV, chop it into lines, take each one of the lines, chop it into individual data elements, and then the element that I'm interested in taking, just bringing it to a list that I now have as a sorted list of all the first names of the students. Similarly, if I wanted to do last names, for example, I can just copy paste this and say last names is going to be another empty string. And then I'm going to copy paste here and say last names. To last names, I want to add the element that is at position 0 in each one of my rows. So I want to add element that is at position number 0. And then now I can copy paste this here, for example, and say this is going to be last names, and this is going to be last names, and this is going to be last names, and then I can print here first names and last names. And I have these two lists with this very relevant data about my students. Okay? Now, what if I wanted, for example, to store the final grade of the students? Okay? This final grade is a number, all right? So what I could do is I can say, all right, bar final grades is going to be a new list of double elements. Okay? And then here, we could think that, oh, it's got to be as easy and as just saying final grades and then add row data number, what is it? It's going to be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So this is going to be in position number 7. But something is wrong, okay? I'm getting an error here. What is this error? Let's see what it tells me. I cannot convert from a string to a double. This is a very common error when we are parsing CSV files. And this is because when you are parsing the data from a CSV file, remember, all the data that we got from the CSV file were an array of string objects. And okay? And then when we split each one of the rows with a comma, what we get is also an array of string objects. So even though what we have in position 7 is just numbers and a dot, even though that is the case and us as humans, we can see that these are numbers, for the computer, the representation that the computer is using to store that in memory is a string. And the computer doesn't really care, doesn't really look at what the data looks like. So technically, this, what is in position number 7, is a string type object and therefore cannot be stored in a list that is taking doubles. So what we need to do is before we store those grades here in final grades, we need to take that string and we need to convert it into a double. Okay? So how can we do that? There's a couple of ways we can do that. So for example, let's say double grade is going to be equal to convert dot to double. And then here I'm going to pass the row data number 7 string. Okay? And then here I'm going to add the G value. Okay? And then if I do that, let's see if that works. The code now works. And then here I can probably print now the final grades. And this is going to be final grades dot count and final grades in position I. If I print this, now you can see that for each one of them, I have the value of the final grades. And because all their decimals are 0, even though I do have the decimal, C# doesn't bother printing that to the console because it's 0, okay? So I think we're pretty much done because we are now, it's a bit laborious, okay? Because right now we have to split everything manually. We have to create independent lists of data for each data type. So the first name, the last name, the grades, etc. And some of them we actually have to manually convert them to numbers or maybe Boolean values, or maybe other types of data. Okay, but the data is there and the process is there. Now, if we wanted to just take more and more of this list of data, it's just a matter of adding more of these parsing operations and adding to the list here inside of the main for loop that we're using to parse over each one of the lines of code and then split them into each one of the data units. Before we move on, I want to mention something. This code, so we could keep adding more final grades, test grades, etc. And we could just parse all the data here. I just want to mention that this code is okay for a data set that is small and that we can visually understand, but it's not very resilient because typically CSV files or data sets in general, it's great if they're all so consistent and so nice and clean as this one, where we have data for all the columns and the data looks good for all the columns. But remember how at the beginning of the video, I detected by opening in a spreadsheet, I detected that this one line had an error and it had a missing comma, and therefore each one of the columns was offset by 1 unit, which meant that the column with the final grades, on this line of code, it had a letter instead of a number. What that means is that if I were to run my code on this faulty CSV file with an error, what I would get is that the code would not execute, because when the code gets to this line, the line that has an A in the column of the final grades, then it's not able to parse or to convert this letter into a double, and therefore my code breaks. So what is the solution to that? Well, it depends on what you're doing, and it depends on the data exploration and the quality of the data that you have. You may want to add exceptions here where you check if what you're reading can be converted to a double or not, and therefore add that element to the list or not. But also, this is not great practice, because imagine that I decided not to add this one particular data here. I would have then an offset between the names, last names, and then when it comes to final grade, that is a gap, and then that doesn't add up to, and then I start having like I start having one offset between the names, the list of names, and between the list of grades. So ideally what you want to do is implement something where if one of the data points is not valid, you probably want to discard the whole row and just ignore it pretty much, okay? But also something that you can do is this is also for me, and when I do data visualization, for me this is also a really good way of testing a large data set for problems, because if I find a problem by writing a program that breaks, it means that I can detect where there's faulty data and either removing that from the data set or finding workarounds to figuring that out. Okay. So with that, I think I want to stop here, and I'm going to, in the next 2 videos for this exercise, first of all, the one thing that I want to do is I want to show you a technique for data parsing, which is instead of having individual lists for each one of the columns that I'm trying to bring in from the data set, a very common technique is to create a class that represents, for example, a student, and that I use to store each one of the data points of that student. So I would like to have a student that has a name, a last name, all the tests and the final grade, etc. And then that student encapsulates each one of the rows of the information. So I'm going to record a video to show you how to do that. And then the next video that I'm going to do afterwards is taking this CSV parsing idea, bringing it into a different environment, not Visual Studio, but bringing it to a 3D modeling environment like Rhino and Grasshopper, writing a similar script in that environment so that I can take data from motion capturing, from a movement in 3D with a video game controller, and then parse that into geometrical objects that I can see in 3D in that modeling environment. Okay, so if you're interested in that, just follow up on the next 2 videos of this exercise series.